Liber 81, the butterfly net, Aleister Crowley's Moonchild. Chapter 13 is of the progress of the great experiment, not forgetting our friends last seen in Paris, about whose welfare much anxiety must have been felt. Early in January, Cyril Gray received a letter from Lord Antony Bowling. "My good Gray," it began, "may the new year bring you courage to break your resolutions early. My own plan is to swear off every kind of virtue so that I triumph even when I fall. Morningside is off to America with his new discovery in science. It is that all crime is due to breathing. Statistics show A, that all convicts are guilty of this disgusting habit. B, it is characteristic of all the inmates of our insane asylums. On the other hand, neither crime nor insanity has ever been proved against any person who is not an habitual breather. The case, you see, is complete. Morningside has gone even farther and shown that breathing is akin to drug habits. He has made numerous experiments upon addicts and finds that suppression leads to mental and physical distress of an even more acute type than that which follows the removal of morphia or cocaine from their slaves. There is little doubt that Congress will take immediate action to penalize this filthy vice as it deserves, and fresh air will be included among the drugs to which the Harrison law applies. Hot air, as the natural food of the people, will of course be permitted." I saw Sister Sybil the other day. She was passing through London to visit friends in Scotland. I tried to alleviate that dreadful destiny by asking her to dinner, and we had an amusing séance with my new toy, a youth named Roger Blunt, who is controlled by a spirit called Wooloo, has 8 secondary personalities, and causes pencils to adhere to walls. It cannot be that this is varnish or surface tension or a little of both. It would be too cruel. The Mahatera Fong has vanished from our gaze. He has probably gone to the equator to correct the obliquity of the ecliptic in the interest of the law of righteousness. I'm sorry I believe in that man. I know he's got something that I haven't, and I want it. However, Simple Simon has been nice to me, only he won't talk phenomena. Says that, like a certain pope, he has seen too many miracles to believe in them, which is my own case. He is referring to genuine ones. Hence, difficulty in comprehension of his attitude. I hope you're having a great time with the devil. I envy your blue skies. London is wrapped in fog, and even on fine days I have to go to the War Office. But isn't it a pity those wicked, bad, naughty men know where you are? I have my doubts about magic, but I know Block, and he's the rottenest egg in London. I gather he's at the back of it, some blackmailing articles on you again. But as Morningside would say, you should worry. Come along and see me before, in a moment of madness and despair, you plunge into Vesuvius in hopes of exciting a future Matthew Arnold to immortalize you. Well, here's the best to you. Antony Bowling. There was a brief note, too, from Simon F. It's to be supposed all's well. Rumors of disaster to enemy offensive current in Paris. You had better worry along on your own now. There's other fish frying in this kitchen. An old man may possibly drop in on you early in August. You may recognize him with a strong pair of glasses as your old friend, Simon F. A simple Simon never spoke of himself as I in a letter. He only used the pronoun in conversation as a concession to custom. The black commissioners had also heard from headquarters. Gates was replaced as quick as rail could carry by a man of superior advancement in the Black Lodge. This was the celebrated Dr. Victor Vesquit, the most famous necromancer of his age. There was really little harm in the man beyond his extraordinary perversion in the matter of corpses. His house in Hampton Road was not only a rendezvous of spiritualists, but a home for lost mummies. He based all his magical operations upon dead bodies or detached portions of the same, believing that to endow dead matter with life, the essential of nearly all magic, as he quite rightly saw, it was best to choose matter in which life had recently been manifest. An obvious corollary is that the best bodies are those that have met with a violent death, rather than those which have been subjected to illness and decay. Also, it followed that the best corpses of all were those of executed murderers, whose vitality may be assumed as very great, though on this last point Cyril Gray, for one, would have disagreed with him, saying that the most vital people would have too much respect for the principle of life to commit murder in cold blood. Well, it's not all cold-blooded murder, right? However, Dr. Vesquit had obtained an appointment as a coroner in the most murderous district of London, and uncanny were the rumors that circulated among occult sympathizers. His career had nearly been ruined on 2 occasions by scandal. The notorious Diana Vaughan, you might want to look up Diana Vaughan in, elsewhere, DIANA VAUGHAN. Yeah, that's on this channel. That book, but it had been said was his mistress, and he had become her accomplice in the introduction of the frightful sect of the Palladist. The rumor was not widespread, and Vesquit need not have suffered, but he took alarm and had the unlucky thought of employing Arthwaite to write a book clearing him from all suspicion, by which it naturally was fixed on him forever. The second trouble was his little quarrel with Douglas. Vesquit was senior in the Black Lodge, and Douglas overthrew him by carelessly leaving in a hansom cab some documents belonging to the lodge with Vesquit's name and address attached to them, which made some exceedingly grim revelations of the necromantic practices carried on in Hampton Road. The honest cabby had turned over the papers to Scotland Yard as his duty was, and the police had sent them on to those in authority over corners, and Vesquit received with his documents an intimation that he must drop that sort of thing at once. To be chief in the lodge seemed less than to be always in a paradise of corpses, so he resigned office, and Douglas pushed his advantage by making him an abject tool under the perpetual threat of exposure. No sooner did Douglas learn of the death of Gates than he telegraphed to Arthwaite to get the inquest adjourned, so that the relatives of the deceased in England might attend and take possession of the body, and of Vesquit to attend the same. On this occasion, the coroner needed no threat. The job was after his own heart. Douglas met him in Paris in high glee, for he was not sorry to be rid of Gates. And on the other hand, the man had died in full tide of battle, and should be the very corpse that Vesquit most needed, as Douglas himself said, with a certain grim humor in which he excelled. He was, morally speaking, an executed criminal, while being in actual magical contact with Gray and his friends so much that he had evidently been killed by them. He was an ideal magical link. The squid's task was, if possible, to learn from Gates exactly what had happened, and so expert a necromancer had no fear of the result. He was also to create semi-material ghost of Gates from the remains and sent it to the person who had dealt out death to that unlucky wizard. On his arrival at the Pauls, there was no difficulty in the way of the Black Lodge. The authorities were only too glad to return a formal verdict of death by misadventure and hand over the corpse to the rejoicing Besquit. Gates had fortunately left memoranda, a rough diary of the various procedures hitherto adopted, so that Besquit was not committed to the task of acquiring information from Arthwaite, which might have easily occupied a season. And from these notes, the old necromancer came to the conclusion that the enemy was to be respected. Gates had done pretty well in the matter of the pigeons at first. His procedure was not to be compared with his colleagues' pedantic idiocies, but the first touch of riposte had been indeed deadly. Gates had been the clairvoyant of the party. He had gauged clearly enough the result of his operation, but naturally he had left no note of the last act, and neither Arthwaite nor Athelbay had been able to do anything. Arthwaite had been scared badly until his pompous vanity came to the rescue and showed him that accidents of that kind must be expected when one is handicapped with an assistant of inferior ability. Besquit decided that the battle should be properly prepared and no trouble spared to make it a success. His fondness for corpses had not gone to the length of desiring to become one. In him there had been the makings of a fairly strong man, and with Douglas to push him on, he was still capable of acting with spirit and determination. Also, he had the habit of authority. He set Arthwaite to work on the grimoire, for in an operation of this importance one must make all one's instruments. Beginning with a magic knife, which one is allowed to buy, one cuts the magic wand from a hazel, the magic quill from a goose, and so on. The idea is to confirm the will to perform the operation by a long series of acts ad hoc. It is even desirable to procure parchment by killing a consecrated animal with the magic knife and making ready the skin with similarly prepared utensils. One might, for instance, cut and consecrate even the pegs which stretch the skin. However, in this case, Arthwaite had plenty of virgin parchment in stock, with quills of black vulture and ink made by burning human bones and mixing the carbonized products with the soot of the magic dark lantern, whose candles were prepared with human fat. But the grimoire of any great operation must be thought out and composed according to elaborate rules, indeed, but with the purpose of the work constantly in mind. Even when all this is done, the grimoire is hardly begun, for it must be copied out in the way above indicated, and it should be illumined with every kind of appropriate design. This was an ideal task for Arthwaite. He was able to wallow in dog Latin and corrupt Greek Coptic. He made sentences so complicated that the complete works of George Meredith, Thomas Carlyle, and Henry James, tangled together, would have seemed in comparison like a word of 3 letters. His grimoire was in reality excellent for its purpose, for the infernal hierarchy delights in unintelligible images, in every kind of confusion and obscurity. This particular lucubration was calculated to drag the archdemon, a bad syntax himself, from the most remote corner of his lair. For Arthwaite could not speak with becoming unintelligibility. To knot a sentence up properly, it has to be thought out carefully and revised. New phrases have to be put in. Sudden changes of subject must be introduced. Verbs must be shifted to unexpected localities. Short words must be excised with ruthless hand. Archaisms must be sprinkled like sugar plums upon the concoction. The fatal human tendency to say things straightforwardly must be detected and defeated by adroit reversals, and if a glimmer of meaning yet remain under close scrutiny, it must be removed by replacing all the principal verbs by paraphrases in some dead language. Now that is, that's Arthur Edward Waite to a T, right? Was it White? But this is not to be achieved in a moment. It is not enough to write disconnected nonsense. It must be possible for anyone acquainted with the tortuosities, the tortuosities of the author. Of the author's mind to resolve the sentence into its elements and reproduce not the meaning, for there is none, but the same mental fog from which he was originally suffering. An illustration is appended. Well, the tortuosity of the whole thing is what one might call West Anglican curmudgeon. If you understand that it's like, oh, well, I don't remember how long Arthur Edward White's books are, but instead of 100 pages, you can probably write what he's saying in 5 pages, right? Yeah. Pneumaticals, omniscient, spirits all, tabernacular, infractually dwelling below, homotopic, hermeneutical, this magic, uvolim peripunct, supra-orientalize, circle arise, factote, kinematodrastically, move soon, overplus phenomenize, and appear. Upon this skeleton, a fair example of his earlier manner, for no man attains the summit of an art in a day. He would build a superstructure by the deft introduction of parentheses, amplifying each word until the original coherence of the paragraph was diluted to such an extent that the true trail was undiscoverable. The effect upon his public was to impress them with the universality of his learning. Arthwaite, being thus well out of harm's way, Vesquit and Abdul set to work on the less arduous of the preparations. 4 black cats were needed for the 4 points of the compass, and it was desirable to massacre a goat upon the altar, which would be no less than the corpse itself. Vesquit, declaring that the body was to be sent to England, had a dummy shipped off in a coffin, and kept gates on ice, which may or may not have been a great comfort to him. Abdul had no difficulty in procuring the cats, which, much to their dissatisfaction, were caged in Arthwaite's study and fed on human flesh, which Vesquit easily procured from the dissecting rooms of the local hospitals. But the goat was a more serious matter. An ordinary goat will not do. It had to qualify in certain respects. Abdul succeeded in his quest only after a series of intrigues with the lowest ruffians and Nepals, which brought him into more vulgar and unpleasant dangers than he had contemplated. When he first put that uniform on, it was, however, at least temporarily, a very amusing situation for the goat. The requisite bat, which must be fed on a woman's blood, was easily arranged for. A courageous country girl offering to accommodate with a toe for a consideration. The nails from a suicide's coffin and the skull of the parricide were, of course, no trouble, for Vesquit never traveled without these household requisites. There were many other details to arrange. The consideration of a proper place for the operation gave rise to much mental labor. It is generally speaking desirable to choose the locality of a recent battle, and the greater number of slain, the better. There should be some very desirable spots in the vicinity of Verdun for black magicians who happened to flourish after the vulgar year 1917. But the grimoires were written in other times with other manners. Nowadays, there is a risk of disturbance if one sets up one's paraphernalia of goats and cats at a crossroads in the hopes of helping oneself out with a recently interred suicide or ceremonially annihilated vampire, or the peasants of the 14th century would have fled shrieking. The motorist of the 20th century stops to observe, or more likely runs you over, so that unless your property includes a private battlefield, it is a point of valor to choose a more retired site for one's necromancy than the stricken field of the Marne. Crossroads, again, are not so thickly planted with suicides and vampires as in happier days, reflecting solidly and ably upon these points of modern degeneracy. Vesquit made up his mind to compromise and accepted the most agreeable substitute, a profane chapel. It was easy to rent a villa with a chapel attached, and to a man of Vesquit's ability, the work of a moment to profane it. Does that mean what I think it does? But anyways, the whole, there's some serious. I mean, if you don't get accused of murder and maybe even convicted as a result of all this, there's still some lesser charges that can end up giving a person years in prison. So definitely look at the real world consequences for your deeds. Thank you very much. This accordingly arranged through Abdul Bey, the mind of this youth was very forcibly impressed upon the preparations of the old coroner. He had been brought up in the modern school and could laugh at superstition with the best of us, but there were traces of hereditary faith in Islam, and he was not skeptical enough to spoil the magic of Vesquit. No man knew better than the necromancer that all this insane ceremonial was irrational. Well, you're trying to have the breakthrough, right? But it so happens that everything on this planet is ultimately irrational. There is not and cannot be any reason for the causal connection of things, if only because our use of the word reason already implies the idea of causal connection. But even if we avoid this fundamental difficulty, Hume said that causal connection was not merely unprovable but unthinkable, and in shallower waters still one cannot assign a true reason why water should flow downhill or sugar tastes sweeter in the mouth. Attempts to explain these simple matters always progress into a learned lucidity, and on further analysis retire to a remote stronghold where everything is irrational and unthinkable. Why cut off a man's head? He dies. Why? Because it kills him. That is really the whole answer. Learned excursions into anatomy and physiology only beg the question. It does not explain why the heart is necessary to life, to say that it is a vital organ. Yet, that is exactly what is done. The trick that is played on every inquiring mind. Why cannot I see in the dark? Because light is necessary to sight. No confusion of that issue by talk of rods and cones and optical centers and foci and lenses and vibrations is very different to Edwin Arthwaite's treatment of the long-suffering English language. Knowledge is really confined to experience. The laws of nature are, as Kant said, the laws of our minds, and as Huxley said, the generalization of observed facts. It is therefore no argument against ceremonial magic to say that it is absurd to try to raise a thunderstorm by beating a drum. It is not even fair to say that you have tried the experiment, found it would not work, and so perceived it to be impossible. You might as well claim that as you had taken paint and canvas and not produced a Rembrandt. It was evident that the pictures attributed to his painting were really produced in quite a different way. You do not see why the skull of a parricide should help you to raise a dead man, as you do not see why the mercury in a thermometer should rise and fall, though you elaborately pretend that you do. And you could not raise a dead man by the aid of the skull of a parricide, just as you could not play the violin like Chrysler, though in the latter case you might modestly add that you thought you could learn. This is not the special pleading of a professed magician. It boils down to the advice not to judge subjects of which you are perfectly ignorant, and is to be found stated in clearer and lovelier language in the essays of Thomas Henry Huxley. Dr. Victor Vesquit, to whom the whole of these ideas was perfectly familiar, proceeded with his quaint preparations unperturbed by the least doubt of their efficacy. He had found that they worked, and he cared no more for the opinion of those who, whatever their knowledge of other branches of science might be, were not experts in necromancy, than does Harry Vardon, when it is proved to him with the utmost scientific precision that he cannot possibly hit a golf ball so long as he swings as he does, and uses that mechanically effective grip. It is also to be remarked that the contrary holds good. No method of doing anything has yet been found which cannot be bungled by the inept. So, as the Persian poet says, who hath the how is careless of the why. It was early in the course of Dr. Vesquit's preliminaries that what Arthwaite called the Antillan phonetical Daliskyarchy, the secret service which had been established, reported to him a complete change in the routine of the people of the butterfly net. On the 7th of January, Aliel reported that the first point of the work was in all probability attained. All that was now necessary was to concentrate upon the real crux of the case, the catching of the butterfly. The household was reorganized accordingly. Cyril Gray withdrew himself completely from the company of Iliel and joined the church militant here on earth, while Iliel herself came under the direct care of Sister Clara, the point within the triangle of women. She took part in their invocations as the focus to which they were directed. While the men were wholly busied in watching over the safety of the fortress, their faces turned inexorably outward, their sole business to assure the security of the three women and their treasure. Upon these facts being brought to the notice of Edwin Arthwaite, he smiled. He had redeemed his earlier failures. Due to the incapacity of his assistants by a sweeping success, for to his magic evidently was due the observed change in nature. Shortly after the arrival of Vesquit, he had completed his latest operation, the bewitchment of 3 nails in such a manner that if struck into the door of a room of a house, the occupants would thereby be debarred from the enjoyment of a conjugal felicity, and here was the result, shining before him, beautiful with banners. Even the pretense of amity had been abandoned. As a matter of fact, Brother Onofrio had discovered the nails and taken the proper measures to return the current to its center. But on this occasion it was as Tatak the Brix af Highland Mon. Arthwaite was totally insensible to the malice of his adversary, and remained in the enjoyment of his supposed victory. He resolved to steal a match on Vesquit. Why should he share his glory with another? He had the enemy on the run. He had better pursue them forthwith. Vesquit's slow methods would only give them time to recover. So he resolved upon the chivalrous, if perilous, course of Cat's Cradle. This magical operation, the relics of which are familiar, even the most unspiritually minded children, is exceedingly widespread. especially among nations which live principally by fishing, as for example the South Sea Islanders. It's some of these preserve sailing patterns, of course. Many most intricate and beautiful patterns have been devised, and of these the wayfaring man may partake by a perusal of Dr. W.W.R. Ball's monograph upon the subject. That able mathematician, however, neglects unpardonably the magical side of the matter. The theory is apparently based upon the fact that the most elusive objects, birds, butterflies, and fishes, may be taken by means of a net. It is argued, therefore, that anything whatever, no matter how elusive, such as the ghost of one's father or the soul of one's enemy, may be caught similarly through the course of the net. Though the course of the net must be adapted to the special game that one is after. 70,000 years ago and more recent, in Arabia, there's all these enclosures built that were used to trap game. With these things, Arthwaite was familiar, and it occurred to him that it should be easy to identify string, or preferably catgut, with the viscera of his victims. There could then be no difficulty in knotting up the cords in such a pattern, for example, as the many stars, or the owl, or the zigzag lightning, and assuredly the magicians thus assailed would find similar rearrangements of the contents of their peritonia. And we find this sort of thing going on in Africa too, and it has, more magical connotation than it does with the island people. After various preliminary exercises annoying to the objects of this solicitude, Arthwaite proposed to proceed to the grand operation of all, tying up his gut in the elusive yam pattern, which is from the greatest complexity, dissolves like a dream at a single last twist. The persons thus sympathetically treated would obviously perish, no less miserably than did Eglon, king of Moab, or Judas Iscariot. The advantage of this operation is evidently its extreme simplicity and economy. While if it works at all, it surely leaves nothing to be desired in such Teutonic qualities as thoroughness and frightfulness. Whether from any difficulty in identification or otherwise, it was some little while before Arthwaite began to feel that his plan was working out. The trouble with all these operations was in the absence of a direct link with the principles. The currents invariably struck the outer defenses in the person of Brother Onofrio before penetrating. When, therefore, Arthwaite's efforts began to show results, they were first noticed by that sturdy warrior, and he, considering the situation, argued that the observed phenomena were due to nature or to magic, and that in either case the remedy lay in opposing no resistance to the forces, but allowing them to operate in a laudable manner. Accordingly, he took a large dose of a medicine known to the pharmacist as hydrogrug subchlor, hydrorg subchlor, adding the remark, if this be nature, may it do me good, and if this be magic, may it do him good. This occurred just as Arthwaite reached his final operation, the evisceration of his enemy. That night, both parties were successful in causing things to happen, and the morning after, Arthwaite was securely incarcerated in the quarantine hospital of the city, and the newspapers were paragraphing a suspected case of Asiatic cholera. However, in 5 days the symptoms abated. The case was declared non-infectious, and the pallid shadow of the disconcerted sorcerer was restored to the more congenial atmosphere of his grimoire and mathematical creations essays. Chapter 14 is going to be an informative discourse upon the occult character of the moon, her threefold nature, her fourfold phases, and her 8 and 20 mansions, with an account of the events that preceded the climax of the great experiment, but especially of the vision of Iliel. And so, what's this? Yeah, that's a difficult word there. Hydrarg, hydrarg, hydrarg. Yeah.